Well, let's start with the overview, if we can. What do you think happened in Russia over the last 36 hours?
Well, I wouldn't call it a coup. I think what happened is that Mr. Prigozhin, who, as you know, is a well-known blowhard and has frequently said outrageous things, reached the conclusion that I think a lot of people in the senior ranks of the Russian army have reached, and that is two things. First, that this war has dragged on too long, and they want Putin to take decisive action to end it. And then secondly, I think the fear is that the United States will be tempted to intervene in Western Ukraine with its Polish allies and others potentially if this does not come to an end. And so Prigozhin staged this. He went down to Rostov to the theater command center. He stayed there. There was no violence, but then he dispatched 4,000 troops to go toward Moscow. 30,000 troops in the Moscow garrison were mobilized and prepared to fight. And ultimately, Russian aircraft and attack helicopters were used against the 4,000 troops that Prigozhin had sent toward Moscow. So at least in Moscow, people took this very seriously. As soon as there was any indication of fighting and that anyone could be killed, Prigozhin immediately called a halt to it. Lukashenko, who has known Mr. Prigozhin for 20 years at least and is a close friend of his, spoke with Putin, who gave him permission to talk directly to Prigozhin, and the outcome was, as you say, Prigozhin leaves and goes to Belarus. There will be no charges against him. And one of the reasons for that is that both the Wagner group and Prigozhin are very popular with the Russian people. They see him as the kind of aggressive leader that they want on the battlefield in this war with Ukraine. So I think what we have now to expect is a very powerful offensive will be unleashed, that is, against the Ukrainians. And then secondly, I think you're going to see some changes at the top of the Russian command structure. I would expect General Surovikin in particular to rise as a result of this. But like you, I see no evidence, frankly, that Mr. Prigozhin was made an agent by MI6 or the CIA or anybody else. Anybody who knows the Russians knows that any senior officer or commander or leader is surrounded by numerous FSB informants. The idea that he could have sold out even if he'd wanted to seems ludicrous.
Yes, that's also my view. Let's start at Machiavelli. In The Prince, he warns the powerful against reliance on the mercenary. It would never have happened in the old days that I look back on more fondly than you do. The idea that a Bonaparte would be allowed to arise within the state is fanciful. Zhukov didn't last long on his white horse after the victory parade in 1945, precisely for that reason. And I apologize for comparing Zhukov with Prigozhin, but it makes my point that how did it come to pass that the Russians allowed the growth of this mercenary power inside their polity, their military polity, and a man like Prigozhin at the head of it?
Well, I would reject the notion that these people are mercenaries. I would compare them to the French Foreign Legion. The French Foreign Legion consists of large numbers of non-Frenchmen in many cases, but they have sworn allegiance to the French state and the French nation, and no one has fought harder and more loyally for France than the French Foreign Legion. I would say you have something very similar in the Wagner group. These are still Russians overwhelmingly, but there are numbers of Serbs, there's some Germans or others in the group, and they too have sworn allegiance to the Russian state. And as far as we can tell, none of them thought that they were marching on Moscow to remove Putin. On the contrary, they saw themselves as going to Moscow to rescue Putin from what was widely considered bad advisors, bad counselors, who have held up the Russian offensive and caused this war to drag out beyond the point of reason.
Well, let's turn to that, for that is, of course, the most important point. The dichotomy has been, although you wouldn't think it reading the Western media, between people who want more and harder war in Ukraine and people like Putin who want to proceed cautiously, bit by bit, not going farther than they need to, not doing more than they must. And that balance is bound to have been deleteriously affected from the point of view of Ukraine and its Western backers, which makes it all the more odd that they were cheering on Prigozhin quite so enthusiastically, Colonel.
I think you're dealing with a lot of wishful thinkers in the West. These are the same people that continue to tell everyone that the Russians are incompetent, stupid, badly led, poorly organized. That's all nonsense. The Russians have proven, if anything, to be extremely professional, very competent. I think a number of things have occurred, though, in recent months. One is that it's very clear that the Ukrainians have collapsed militarily for all intents and purposes. The casualties they've taken are horrific. There really isn't much left. And lots of senior officers, and I'm sure Surovikin is one of them, have said, look, let's get on with this, put an end to this, regain control of everything east of the Dnieper, regain control of Odessa, then we can decide what we want to do next. The second thing is there's been a lot of very dangerous talk in Washington about nuclear weapons. You have this piece of legislation that's under consideration in the Senate that talks about threatening Russia with nuclear strikes if they detect anything that they consider to be evidence for a Russian nuclear operation. The Russians have made it very clear they will not use nuclear weapons unless we do. However, Zelensky has been encouraging his forces to attack the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant on the Dnieper River. The Russians have guarded it and protected it, tried to shut it down as much as possible because they don't want the radioactivity loose. But this is the kind of dirty bomb threat that Zelensky has made real for a long time. As a result, the Russians, I think, collectively have said, good Lord, what happens if this man Zelensky succeeds in something at the plant that it amounts to a dirty bomb or the equivalent of it, and then the U.S. uses it as an excuse to intervene and launch a tactical nuclear weapon against us? I think these things were also on Prigozhin's mind. I think it's why Prigozhin said, I've got to do something dramatic to get Putin's attention. Remember, Putin and he have known each other for many years. This is not what people think. That's why I don't buy the notion it's a coup. I think he got Putin's attention. I think we're going to see change at the top, and I think this offensive is going to be unleashed. That's the outcome that Prigozhin wanted.
And were that to be now unleashed, it would indeed, as you put it, be everything up to the river and everything to the south, including virtually the whole of the seaboard, and certainly including Odessa. That would leave a rump state, to put it kindly, a kind of Kosovo style rump entity that would be of interest, I would have thought, to at least the Poles and maybe even the Hungarians also, and would redraw the map completely. Would the Americans shrug and accept that, or would that strengthen the Lindsey Grahams and Blumenthal and the like, who clearly want America and Russia in a toe-to-toe shooting war, including shooting nuclear missiles in Europe?
Well, I don't know that the fools in Washington really want a nuclear confrontation. I think they enjoy threatening it. They don't understand what they're talking about. And I know the Russians don't. There's much truth in what you're saying, except that I would point out that Putin would probably accept almost any solution on the west side of the Dnieper along the lines that you described, provided whatever emerges in this rump state is neutral. And that was the real concern from the very beginning. He wasn't interested in going to war. He wasn't interested in marching into Kyiv or anything else. He simply wanted Ukraine to be neutral, not a platform for NATO and the United States to use against him. And if we and the people that border Russia are willing to sign a treaty that accepts neutrality for what remains, I'm sure that Putin would go along with it. No foreign bases, no foreign forces. That would be his concern.
Yes, and of course that could have been achieved. In fact, an outcome less onerous than that could have been achieved under the aegis of President Erdogan until Boris Johnson was dispatched to quash it. Do you think he did that of his own volition, or did Washington tell him to?
How do I say this as diplomatically as possible? London is Washington's puppet. End of discussion. So unfortunately, no, he didn't think of it on his own, though he's quite capable of dumb ideas. I agree. But nevertheless, this dumb idea came out of Washington to keep the war going. It's over. The people in Washington know the Ukrainians are finished. They know they can't replace the losses. The question now is what comes next, and nobody wants to accept publicly the fact that the Russians are in a strategically powerful and dominant position. That's not going to change. But there is still margin for mistakes and error. There's still an opportunity here for someone to push too far, for an opportunity for the U.S. to engage in an intervention that could widen this war and make it Europe-wide. That's the real danger. We're not prepared for it, by the way. Let's be quite clear on this. We don't have the ammunition. We don't have the forces on the ground. But it's not impossible. And I think that's what drove Prigozhin. I think that's what concerns the senior officers in the Russian army. They want to end it.
Now, the senior officers, undoubtedly at the front, are tired of the Minister of Defense. They're tired of the top brass back in Moscow. Do you think that replacing them, rotating them, finding some way of nudging them sidewards or upstairs to the boardroom or whatever, was part of the negotiation with Prigozhin?
Yes, although I'm sure that President Putin did not obligate himself to do exactly what Prigozhin argued should be done. Nevertheless, I think, yes, he understands now clearly that Prigozhin is not the Lone Ranger. Everyone at the top, or almost everyone in the battlefield, wants to get on with this. It reminds me, frankly, of 1990 and 91, when we were sitting in the desert and suddenly there were discussions about turning the border between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait into something like the Korean border, something that Colin Powell at the time seemed to advocate, and we feared that most of the Army four-stars would accept. Fortunately, President Bush rejected that out of hand and said no. And we were all greatly relieved when we attacked because we didn't want to sit in that desert eternally. Now, I think the same feeling is very widespread inside the ranks of the Russian army. People are sitting there, I don't want to be here next year. So let's get on with this. Let's attack. Let's destroy these people. Let's force people to the table, come up with an agreement, and we can go home.
Now, are things changing in Washington? After all, Joe Biden visibly enfeebled, sorry to say this as diplomatically as I can. London may be Washington's puppet, but the puppet master in the Oval Office leaves a very great deal to be desired. Seldom can there have been a ventriloquist as unimpressive as Joe Biden, but he looks enfeebled, he looks confused, he looks not an inch the war leader, and he's now got Donald Trump emerged as the leader of the anti-war movement in America, and he's got RFK Jr. inside his own party, burning up the track with, if anything, an even more trenchant anti-war position. And we're not that far distant from the next primaries and then the next presidential election. Do you think things might begin to change on the home front in that regard?
Well, first of all, I think our friend Biden is a cutout. I don't think he's actually in charge of much. I think he reads from the script that's presented to him. He has powerful forces behind him, powerful donors, and he's got key people in the administration who are helping to manage and handle him. So they're going to keep him there as long as they possibly can because he's at least a face that Americans don't necessarily hate. They may not think much of him, but they don't hate him. But he may not last out the year. And if he doesn't last, then our friend Kamala Harris, who may temporarily become vice president, won't last long. Everyone knows that she's not capable of exercising the powers of the office. So the question is, who comes next? As far as the future election is concerned, many of us in the United States have no faith in the electoral integrity of our system. There's too much cheating, too much lying, mass absentee ballots, mass voter mail-in ballots, all sorts of nonsense that provides in the blue states opportunities for cheating. So I'm not sure when change comes, it necessarily will come as a result of the ballot box. That would be preferred, but I think we're in for more difficult times than that.
Well, difficult, but certainly interesting. And the times will always be interesting as long as you and I can continue to talk about them here on the mother of all talk shows, God willing. Thank you, Colonel Douglas MacGregor.